the diagrams were a little fractured last week, so I thought what I'd do this week is I still want to flick backwards and forwards, and I still want to use stuff that I might not have thought about before the meeting. So I've pulled up a couple of book files, book PDFs, and we can use the diagrams in those. If you haven't got the books, then it's a good teaser, I guess. So we got as far as talking about thermal soaring, and we were going to talk for an hour or so on the nature of centering thermals. My CFA, Graham McAndrew, was a national coach, Geordie guy, BGA national coach, superb pilot. Started as a miner, ended up as a fast jet pilot. And he used to say on his courses, he just introduced the cross-country course, he'd say, there are three important things about cross-country flying: rate of climb, and of course, rate of climb. And most of the stuff you do in speed flying, if you look at speed flying theory, most of the stuff you do in speed flying emphasizes the nature of the fact you need to get a good rate of climb in the thermals. It is the thing that defines people's ability to fly cross country. So it pays to become as good at climbing in thermals as you possibly can. It's easy enough when you pitch up into an ordinary bog standard thermal and there's a couple of gliders in it, you climb with the rest. But it's pretty hard when you're on your own and you come into the bottom of a nasty, natty little blue thermal that's wandering around and trying to go away without you. Just a minor difference in the ability to climb can make a huge difference to the outcome of your flight. So it's really worth talking about. Let's ask some questions first, because I want this to be a bit more interactive and not just me talking. When you're trying to climb in a thermal, you've got a number of sources of information. What are those sources of information? You'll want to go through them and talk about the pros and cons of using each one. What are the sources of information?
Other gliders.
Yep, other gliders.
Cumulus clouds.
Q, yep.
Flat cumulus clouds with black bottoms.
Yep, and little daggy bits at the bottom doing this.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So those are visual cues.
So
You see them by looking out.
we've got instrumentation. And
Okay.
Seat of our pants.
Feel.
Yep. Feel. There is one other clue which is useful.
The way the glider's
You got
moving.
the vision. Sorry, say again.
The way the glider is moving. You know, twisting,
Well, that's
pushing and rolling, and you know, just shuttling.
Yeah, I'd really call that acceleration, the feel of the glider, because yes, you get, you don't only get this sensation or the going down sensation, you also get a little bit of tilting and you get yawing, and you also get turbulence signatures. Like for instance, if you're flying on a shear wave day and there's lots of rolls at the top of the inversion, then when you fly through one of the roll, the glider goes like that. It's like you're hit by God's hammer as you go down, up, down. That there's a particular signature, turbulent signature for being in the wave. When you fly in those wave rotors, turbulent vortices at the top. There's signature for being in the bottom of the thermal. There's a signature for being in the top of a blue thermal. You know when you've got to the top of a blue thermal, I think. You probably know when you're falling out of the bottom of a thermal, and they feel different. You know when you're circling and there's a thermal coming up underneath you. It feels different from being in the top of a blue thermal. So rate of climb versus turbulence signatures. You know when you hit the core and you go into that smooth bit and everything smooths out. With you know so those are all acceleration, the feel of the air, I would say. I suppose you could, if I make a note and say, we'll call that turbulent signature rather than just acceleration. So that's a pretty good distinction, I think. There is still one other thing, and I think it's very important. I use it all the time when I'm flying with students. Okay, so here's the thing. I'm flying with a student. He rolls into the thermal. He does a circle, misses the core. He moves. He does a circle, misses the core. He moves, does a circle, misses the core. I take over, do a circle in the core. It looks really smart, but it's not. He's searched all the bits of the thermal, and I can search the last bit and find the last bit. In other words, history is important. The history is important. You can use another word to describe that. You can say orientation is important. In other words, what happened last is important. So what happened last, history and orientation are important. Okay, so let's run back to those clues. Visual clues. If you're working really hard, it is hard to sustain a good lookout. We know this. One of the things that happens when you're on the Yerkes-Dodson curve, the performance stroke arousal curve, as the arousal goes up, as you try harder and harder and harder, it becomes harder and harder and harder to maintain an awareness of what's going on around you. You know, people tend to grip the stick, like strangle the stick and look straight ahead at the variometer, and they're not head up looking around. So to improve your ability to use visual cues, it's worth doing that routine. I'm not sure if I mentioned it last week, the anti-stress routine that I was taught, which is to, well, I say look up, sorry, lift off, look up, look out. Did I mention that last week? No, okay. So imagine you're trying to climb and you're stressed and you're looking straight ahead and you're gripping the stick and pushing on both rudder pedals. And if you're instructing, students will do this. In order to get them to use the visual and acceleration cues, you do this. You say, lift off, and you take your hand off the stick and you pull your feet off the rudder pedals and you take a breath and you just let go of the glider. Now the glider should just carry on flying because it's trimmed, right? If it's not trimmed, it needed to be, or it's nearly trimmed. So you lift off, you sit back, you take a deep breath, and then as you breathe out, you put your fingers back on the stick. And when you put your fingers on the stick, here's the stick, you just touch it. You know, maybe if you're turning right, you're pulling the stick backwards and out of the turn. So you just touch it like that. If you're turning left, you touch it like that. If you're running straight, I used to fly my Lebel with my hands either side of the stick because the cockpit's like cramped like this. I used just to have one hand either side of the stick, fly with both hands all the time, but I'd hardly ever touch it. So you just touch the stick, don't grip it. You put your feet on. If you're turning to the right, you have right rudder. You don't necessarily want to be completely true. You might be very slightly slipping, but you'll have right rudder. It won't be left of center, it'll be right. So the right foot is further forward than the left. So to stop pressing both feet on the rudder pedals, what I do is I have my right heel further forwards on the floor of the cockpit than my left. My feet become asymmetric. I put my right heel further forwards, just an inch, or I pull my left foot back. So I've got my right foot, my inside foot is kissing the rudder pedal, and my left, my outside foot, the knee is higher up and pulled back very slightly in the cockpit. And that asymmetry in your legs stops you pushing hard with both feet on the rudder pedals. Because if you've got one heel further back, then in order to push with both feet, you've got to do that with your toe, which is awkward. So that is a way of controlling the pushing hard with both feet. I had in the Lebel, I put sandpaper tape, you know, high grip tape on the floor of the cockpit to enable myself to do that. In other gliders, it doesn't, you know, other gliders are different. But so you take a breath, you lift off. When you breathe out, you put your fingertips on the stick, you put your toe on the rudder pedal. You don't push with both. You deliberately don't push with both. And then you look around and you do a proper scan for traffic, and you look down for clues, because often you've got a duster or you've got a bird, and you look up to see where the cloud is. So I have to make myself do that every 2 or 3 turns, otherwise I get tense in the cockpit, and I get my students to do that. So that's something that helps with the visual cues and the acceleration cues. Also, to help with the acceleration cues, what about speed control in the thermal? They say that, I've heard instructors say, you know, you should keep the speed constants within a couple of knots. Obviously, attitude controls speed. But is that really true in a thermal? Do you really try to keep the speed constant? What controls the speed in the thermal apart from the attitude? There's 2 other things really. What's varying the speed?
Attitude. Well, you've got the gusts in the thermal, which are going to change your speed. If you keep you've got to keep your attitude constant and accept a little bit of fluctuation in airspeed.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Jen. You can't chase the speed. If the speed goes away, you can't chase it by putting the nose down. If the speed comes on, you can't chase it by pulling the nose up. If you have the attitude more or less right, the speed will stay more or less right. The gusts change the speed. That is flying in and out of the thermal. And the other thing that changes the speed is the lift. When you fly into vertical air movement, the glider will accelerate forwards. It will accelerate. The glider's stable, so as the angle of attack changes because you've flown into lift, the glider moves to correct the angle of attack change. It speeds up in lift and slows down in sink. And it's not just flying through gusts, it's flying through acceleration does that. So as the energy comes on, as you fly across the core, you feel the energy come on. The glider does accelerate just a tad in the same attitude. But those effects, you can't chase them. If you chase the speed, then the nose is going up and down all the time. If the nose is going up and down all the time, then you're feeling acceleration, deceleration all the time. And it completely disguises the feel of the thermal. Bear in mind, imagine you're sitting in a weak thermal. Maybe you're in a 2-knot thermal somewhere. It's a pretty shitty day. You're in a 2-knot thermal going round and round, and there's a 3-knot core. So you're flying around at 50 knots and you're trying to feel the difference between 300 feet a minute of vertical air movement and 400 feet of vertical air movement. It's almost nothing. It's a tiny, tiny little signal if you're looking for it with the seat of your pants. It's a tiny signal. Now, if you have the attitude absolutely nailed, completely nailed, you've got the glider like boom, and it's just going around, you're not moving anything, you're on a hair trigger and you're just going like this, you might just feel the glider get pushed upwards a bit. If you're flying like a trainee, if you're doing that thing where the nose is going down and the nose is going up and then it's not turning, and then you know that sort of lurching around a thermal that people do. It's so uncomfortable to be in the glider when somebody's flying like that. If you're lurching around the thermal, there's no chance you're going to feel what's going on if it's at all subtle. I mean, yeah, you get vigorous thermals and you can't help but feel what's going on. But if it's subtle, when it's difficult. So in order to feel the acceleration cues, you have to be absolutely smack on with the handling. It's not generally understood, but I don't know if any of you have had anything to do with motorsport. It is perfectly possible for many, many people to become really good drivers if you learn to drive a Formula car or a rally car. You know, that driving skill is quite accessible. You just go and learn to do it. But it's utterly different from driving on the road, completely and utterly different. You get on a racetrack, it's a completely different environment. When you fly sailplanes, you have to be as good at handling the sailplane as a racing driver is as good as handling a car. You have to have excellent aircraft control in that circling slowly, low speed flight area. You also need pretty good control in the area of flying approaches. You need to be a bush pilot. You know, you need to be able to come in at minimum speed and not drop it onto the ground in a heavy landing, and not run out of the, because you know, you've got to land in fields. You've got to be good. When people go solo, it's like passing your driving test. By the time you've got 1,000 hours, you should be driving the glider like a racing car driver drives his car. You should really have it nailed. I'm flying the SW24. It's tricky. It's really tricky. If you pull too hard, it sinks. On the other hand, if you don't pull hard, you don't go around in circles. Take your pick. So, you know, you learn to do this, and it's worth getting this over to trainees. And it's also worth bearing in mind, if you're a bit out of practice or you're not doing many hours every year, having the handling skill to really be able to fly in thermals and feel the air is quite a difficult thing to do. It's quite an ask. So one other thing then, the history of the thermal, the orientation of the thermal. How many people have heard of the best heading method, the worst heading method of soaring? Yeah, it's an older way of describing how you center in a thermal. If you're going around a thermal and you're flying through a load of sink, then when you leave the sink, you straighten up and fly away from the sink. If you're flying in the lift part of the thermal, if you're flying in the good bit, you think, oh, this is the best bit. Next circle, I'll move over this way a bit. So the best heading, worst heading methods, that's what they're called. The orientation of where the lift and the sink are depend largely on the vario. As you come around the circle and the vario peaks, let's say the vario in the best bit of the thermal was reading 6 knots, you tend to think, oh, this is the best bit of the thermal. Okay, so let's talk about variometry. That's probably not true. Why is it not true?
There's built-in delay with
There's
the,
there's a big built-in delay. Now, it's worth investigating this just a little bit. When you fly into the side of the thermal and the glider goes da-da-da-da, you get a bang, and the vario, it goes bang, and the vario comes up straight away. The vario is instantaneous with the bang when you hit a gust. But especially if you've been doing a bit instructing, or if you're really good at thermal soaring, you'll have worked this out. Quite often, you'll come into the acceleration and the glider will go up and you'll rack the glider over, and then the vario would come up. It'll be a bit like this. And the vario is after the acceleration, after the lift. And it's sometimes it's enough after the lift that I can say to the student, turn here, turn now, here it is. Or, you know, you go up the slope and I go, yeah, here it is, turn now. A second, 2 seconds delay. Now, the reason for this, the instrument is fast. Pressure transducer instruments are just like that, and no delay at all. But there's the delay in the movement of the glider as it crosses the core. As it flies across the middle of the thermal, it doesn't generate a height difference to generate a vario signal instantaneously. The glider's flying along. I've got a glider somewhere. I've got a Spitfire. The glider's flying along and it hits the lift, hits the core of the thermal, and the flight path changes. But the vario has to measure the difference between being here and being here, though that height difference, over a period of time to call it a rate of climb. You have to generate that height difference. But the lift was here. If you imagine flying along level and then pulling the stick back, you feel the acceleration, then you have a height difference. The extra lift was when you pulled the stick back. That's when the glider accelerated upwards, and then it goes up. So when it flies into the thermal pushes the glider and the flight path changes, and then it's going up. So there has to be a delay. It doesn't matter how fast the variometer is, there will be a delay in the signal. And here's the trick. There is zero delay in gusts, and the Vario reacts strongly to gusts. There is quite a long delay in responding to the lift, and the Vario responds quite weakly to the lift signal. The magnitude of the gust response is bigger than the magnitude of the response to the thermal. And I won't go into why that's another technical thing, but trust me, the glider, the Vario, the total energy Vario is well oversensitive to gusts and undersensitive to vertical movement. So you've got a very, very noisy Vario, which reads the thermal late. Now, we know we damp the Vario down, and the modern gliders use processing, use algorithms, use mathematical filtering to change the Vario signal to try to identify the gusts, the speed changes, and to take them out. But it's still a very noisy signal. And the best way to think about this, I think, if you look at your moving map, you've got the moving map and you've got your glider icon on the moving map. And as you go around the turn, it goes. Every time the moving map refreshes the screen. And if you want to straighten up and go in this direction, go straight up the screen, you go straighten up. You'd straighten up before the moving map icon is pointing in the direction you want to go, because you know there's a time lag, right? You know there's a time lag in the GPS moving map. The time lag in the Vario system is about of the same order. It's not half a turn. It's not a turn and a half. It's not 2 degrees of turn. It's about 15, 20, 25, 30 degrees of turn. It's about the difference between 12 o'clock and 11 o'clock, somewhere in there. So as you go across the center of the thermal, you're pointing in that direction and you go, ah, this is the best bit. Well, the best bit isn't there. The best bit was when you were there, maybe 30 degrees back round the turn. Not here, there. I'm hoping that's making sense, as if you can visualize yourself in the cockpit. So in other words, when you're using orientation, it's slow. Orientation is about 30 degrees behind the Vario signal. So that's kind of dispensed with some of the clues that you're in a thermal. I want to talk about techniques now. What were you taught when you started, and what would you teach a beginner? What are the important things right at the beginning of learning to climb?
Well, I reckon that the first important thing to teach him is to control his angle of bank so that he has an idea of his history. If your angle of bank's varying and you're wobbling all over the sky, then it's pretty hard to keep a good history of where you're getting the good bits and the bad bits.
Yes, I'd agree with that. It's also, if you're turning a shallow angle of bank, it's very easy for a slight variation in bank to take you a long way. If you're turning in tight circles, a slight variation in bank doesn't move you very much. Let's just talk about circle sizes and angles of bank and dispense with that. I'll do a screen share. Okay, put a thumb up if you've got a diagram here.
It's good.
You got a diagram? Yeah, okay, good.
Yep.
All right, so this is a page out of volume 1. you need to fly in small circles. That is the first thing, and you need to be able to control the bank. So we need to fly in small circles and control the bank. Those are really important things. If you're flying at 60 knots, you're covering 100 feet per second. You think you're 150 feet behind the tow plane, towing at about 70 knots. You're about a second and a half behind him. If he flies into a cloud, you've got a second and a half to go, whoa, and pull off before you fly into the cloud. It's a second and a half or so. You do 100 feet a second if you're flying at 60 knots. Imagine flying across a thermal core. An ordinary little thermal core. You're launching out of your local site. There's a 3,000-foot cloud base at 11 o'clock in the morning, scattered queue. It's not big thermals yet. So you fly across a thermal. What does it sound like and feel like? I'm going to get my oh, wait one. I want to stop this screen share. Hang on. I want to stop the screen share page, and the bloody page has disappeared. Help, Dave.
Let's see.
Yeah, I've lost the bloody screen share page. Wait one.
Okay, so up in the little banner at the top center, you should have an options. And
No, it's all right. It's gone on the other page. There we go. All right, sorted. Thank you. It's just familiarity with the software. Right, so you're flying across the thermal core. You've come off tow at 2,000 feet. There's little scattered queue at 3. It's not good yet. And you fly across the thermal core, and it goes like this. It's like that. That thermal is only 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds across. If you fly a 20-degree bank, you fly a 1,000-foot circle. A 1,000-foot circle. This is give or take, all right? Give or take, because it depends on the flying speed. Depends on the density of the air. But if you fly a 20-degree bank, it's 1,000 foot across the circle, 1,000-foot diameter. That is 10 seconds across. 10 seconds goes like this. Now, you do get thermals like that, but that's at the very best time of day on a really, really good soaring day underneath a big queue. Generally, thermals aren't 1,000 feet across. Not the best bit. They're normally 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 seconds across, but not 10 seconds across. Coming back to the screen share, if you look at the diagram, 30 degrees is 600 feet, 45 degrees is 500 feet. So you can graph that. Diameter of the circle on the left, angles of bank on the right. And beginners will tend to operate at 20 to 30 degrees, which is just too big a circle. They can't get into the core like that. We'll operate around here, 35 to 45 degrees. Reichman says turn at 40 degrees. I like to say turn at 45 degrees. I say turn at 45 degrees because I'm a mountain pilot and thermals are smaller when you're in the mountains. And 2, it's easier to teach because in the absence of any information from the combing of the instrument panel of the glider, you can do this. I have one I prepared earlier. Of course, when you're looking at the instrument, and you can tell that this is buggered up, when you're at 45 degrees of bank, the instrument is sitting like that against the horizon. You know, the screw holes are level with the horizon outside. So it's a reasonable reference. A bit of an aside here, it is actually substantially difficult to measure exactly what your angle of bank is and to keep to it. It is more difficult than you think. It's one thing going, oh, I'm an experienced pilot, I can turn tight. It's another thing calibrating that turn. So when you turn, you know how tight you're turning. And it's kind of important because at that 45-degree angle of bank, you're riding the rough edge of rapidly increasing G, rapidly increasing rate of sink, rapidly increasing difficulty of handling. So you need to bump, nail it. You need to be able to do that, bump, nail it. If you want to stay really oriented, it's actually quite hard. I've started using a breadcrumb trail, you know, a trace on my Udi. And I've been quite surprised and quite disappointed to see how much my circle will move around if I lose concentration even a little bit. You know, I look around or I talk on the radio and I look back, the computer's in the scan, I look back at the scan and the circle's moved significantly. It's moved significantly. You know how you're trying to just be right in the core and the core's just out, the edge of the core is just outside your circle. You don't have to move very far to be outside the core. You know, a third of a circle diameter, 100 feet, 200 feet. You don't have to move very far to be outside the core. So if you can use a breadcrumb trail and keep track of where you have been, keep a trace of it, it's actually pretty useful. You will discover that you're not as accurate as you thought. The other thing I discovered when I flew the Lebel, easy to fly, lovely to fly. I kept thinking, I have to fly this faster than I should. And then I started measuring the circle size and looking at the angle of bank with a solid state horizon. And I realized that I was flying closer to 50 degrees most of the time than 40 degrees. You know, I was thinking I was 40, 45 degrees. I was actually 45, 50. And it sounds like nothing, but actually it's significant if you're trying to hold the speed back. And of course, it doesn't really help. Flying tighter than a 45-degree turn, there you have the diagram again, doesn't really help because you don't really fly much smaller circle. The smallest circle I've ever recorded since I've been CUing it is about 420 feet. And that was down at sea level on a cold day in a Lebel, absolutely turning like billy shit. Normally you can get it down to about 500 feet in a standard class type. But after that, forget it. It's not really worth turning any harder. So that's the first thing about learning to circle, turn hard. What's the next thing? How do you teach a beginner to center thermals? What do you say?
I normally start with getting them to watch the nose on the horizon and try and get some consistency around speed control and rate of turn.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, excellent point. But what about controlling or varying the angle of bank to move the circle? Where do you want to turn tight? Where do you want to turn slack? How do you want to move the circle if you're teaching a beginner?
Again, I'll take the lead from my LX instrument and just say to them about 90 degrees before you get to the strong part of the thermal, open up the turn, wait a couple of seconds, then roll into it again.
Tighten up and lift, what I say.
Yeah. Tighten up and lift.
I like to feel that gust, feel the gust, open out right there and then. You know, the instrument is not necessarily showing that this is the best part of the lift, but feel the gust, use that, you know, just open up a little bit and then into it again pretty well straight away. You know, don't take off all your bank by any means, just open up a little bit and then turn back into it.
I think that's good. Except I wouldn't say gust, I'd say the acceleration or the
Yeah,
surge
oh,
rather
yeah,
than the gust.
surge, the surge, yes.
Which is more for us than them at this stage. What should you be doing when the Vario is reading its best?
Tighten up.
You should be flying tight, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, the whole point of thermal soaring is the thermals are small. The only way you can make the glider stand still, which you can't do, is to circle really hard. Therefore, where it's good, you circle. If you're going to circle where it's good, you're going to be not circling so tight where it's not so good. Because the rule number one is if you're in the core of the thermal, you have to be turning to stay there. Yeah, you turn so you stay as close to the middle of the thermal as possible. When you're not in the core of the thermal, you want to move the glider so it is in the core of the thermal. And the way to move the glider is to flatten out. And the way to stay where you are is to turn tight. That's how we do it. After all, if we did it a different way, we could imagine a situation where you'd see a thermal and you'd run straight at the thermal, pull up across the middle, come out of the thermal, turn around, pull up across the middle. That would be like the opposite thing, but we don't do that. We circle in the thermal because that's the best bit. So when the Vario is high, you want to be circling tight. That's rule number one. When you move is another question. So now you want to be circling tight when the Vario is good. We know what tight is. It's 45 degrees or 40 degrees if you're Reichmann. So I would say to the student, when the Vario is at its best, bang the wing down, put the glider in the climb attitude, which is dump 45 degrees, and go climb, 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 until that stops. When you're not climbing so well, roll off the bank and have a look around until you hit the core again. And then when you hit the core again, climb, 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 climb. That's the first thing to do, I would suggest, to get this coupling between being in good lift and having the glider sitting tight, going around the turn at a very fixed attitude and angle of bank. The BGA, British Gliding Association, say that you should teach it like this. And I like to get away from the words because lift and sink and gust and surge and acceleration are all confusable because people will say, oh, open out in the lift or turn tighter in the lift. Well, there's the lift of the acceleration, flying up the acceleration, flying up the surge, and there's the lift on the Vario, and that is different things. So I like to use a diagram instead. You should have my variometer on the screen now. And I've drawn a glider on the Vario needle. If you imagine the Vario needle going up to about 5 knots, the glider's just about in a vertical bank, which is what it feels like to somebody who's a beginner. So the first stage of doing this is really to follow the Vario needle. The more lift there is, the more bank you fly, with 45 degrees coming at the best lift. Now that will keep the student climbing. That will keep an early solo pilot, that'll keep him airborne in the club's junior. That'll keep him up in the air. But he'll fly circles like this. The default centering technique, which is to turn like hell in lift, and then as you come out the lift, you open out, you wander around, you rather rely on luck to take you back into somewhere where the thermal is. Then you turn tight again. You're quite likely to spend a long time outside the thermal not climbing properly. So it's not the best way to circle. However, it's a start.
Gee, can I say that there is a bit of a confusion there? And I think the way I sort it out in my mind is say there's a centering aspect and then there's a searching aspect. If you go through a good lift and you get back in the crappy air and you open it out, you're really in a searching mode because you're saying that you know, you're trying to find it, which the action really is. When you come into the action, then you turn really tight again.
Yes.
So that's a searching thing, but the key to it really is about centering. And centering involves almost a little bit the opposite. you come to the really strong bit, and sometimes you're easing off the bank to try and just position yourself a little bit better with regard to the centre. So
Yes, yes, I agree, Roger. And what you're talking about is two slightly different techniques. And you're characterizing this by saying searching and centering, which to you makes sense because you're an experienced pilot. I would characterize it by saying you've got a beginner technique. You've got a technique which is appropriate for beginners and appropriate when you do not know what is going on, because when you don't know what is going on in a thermal, you can't just fly to the core. You've got to use the vario and the acceleration. And then there's an experienced pilot's technique. Let's come back to your idea, because what you say about centering is what I would say about an experienced pilot. So that what we're teaching the beginner is how to crank on the bank in the best bit of the thermal, and the beginner needs to be able to do that and control the glider as he does so, and then he needs to be able to take the bank off and move around a little bit in a controlled fashion. I should have the screen share up. You should have another diagram of that going on. And you can see in the middle of the picture, the glider's turning really hard when he hits the core, but then he flies out of the thermal and he's searching again. In this particular example, he's going to fly into the core, which is great. But as I just said, if you wind off the bank as you leave the thermal, as you leave the core, then you're really going to wander around in the sink for a little while. If you're more experienced, it's best to keep the bank on as you leave the core of the thermal. Rather than winding off the bank as you leave, you need to keep the bank on as you leave. You need to keep the glider turning tight, because you don't want to move very far away from the core. So that brings up the question in a moment, which we'll deal with, which is when do you open up again? But just for a moment, as you fall out of the side of the thermal, as the core is behind you, the speed goes away. I'm going to stop the share for a moment. As you come out of the core of the thermal, the speed goes away because the lift goes away. There's a bit of a bump and the glider sort of sags, and now you have a problem. You're turning quite hard. You're turning at the edge of not really wanting to turn harder and pull harder, because the glider just, you're blowing off energy if you do that. And yet the speed has gone away a bit. So now you're actually turning a bit tight for the energy you have. So what do you do to deal with this? Do you put the nose down a bit, or do you roll out? You're just coming out the core and the glider's going, ugh, and you really want to stay there, but it's gone, ugh. So what's the solution?
Take off a little bit of bank.
Yes, exactly that. Don't put the nose down, because if you put the nose down to regain that attitude, you're going to have to pull even harder. It's a little bit like being slow on the approach. If you're slow on the approach with the nose, if you're slow on the approach in the last stages, there's no point putting the nose down to gain speed. That doesn't really help, because the ground comes up even faster. You don't prompt the student at 100 feet. You don't prompt the student and go, oh, you're a bit slow, because he's going to go, whoa, and that just makes it worse. If you're slow on the approach, you put the brakes away, right? If you're slow coming out of the thermal, you have no choice but to roll off the bank a little bit, reduce the stalling speed, bring the glider's angle of attack down to where it needs to be to go round. Ideally, you will come out of the side of the thermal with enough speed to continue to turn hard. This is one of those racing driver things that I was talking about. The original ASW24, if you fall out the side of the thermal and you yank it round like a bastard, it just goes as you pull. It's horrible. It just sinks like a brick. You've got to know how to fly it. You've got to come out of the core with a little bit more zoom, so you can keep it coming around. A lot of modern gliders are a lot like that. All the modern Schleikers are a little bit like that. Even the ASW19, the LS4, the LS7, I'm not sure about the LS8. They're all a bit like that. My Ash doesn't do that. It's as soft as butter. But a lot of gliders are very sensitive. So you come out the core, you turn as tight as you can to come back in, but you might have to ameliorate that turn just slightly. So this is what you should be doing. You should have the screen share again. You turn tight in the core, you keep turning, and you have to decide at some stage how to move the glider over in the thermal. That's the next thing. So this is Roger's thing. Centering rather than searching. You're going to move the circle a bit. Roger, when are you going to move the circle? What is your clue for moving the circle?
I really don't have an answer to that. Sorry.
Well, that's entirely reasonable. Most of us, if we're experienced pilots, you just know the core's over there because you've done it a zillion times. You just move over and fly in the core. But if you've got to think about it, if you want a process, if you want to have an understood process where you can teach it and describe it, you have to be able to isolate the factors. Let's talk about moving on the vario. You go around the circle. As the vario starts to come up, so you so as the vario comes up, you move. What's the problem with that?
Vario delay.
Yeah, you're late. So if you move the glider as the vario comes up, should have screen share again, you'll move too late. You can see the gray flight path here is the last circle. And then you can see what the pilot's done as he comes up in towards the middle of the thermal, where it goes dot, 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 the flight path changes to dashes. That's where he's wound off the bank, 30 degrees. And he's gonna cross the core in a moderate bank. And then he slammed the bank on as he leaves the core, which is when the vario is probably screaming, and he's just moved his circle sideways. It's not really helped. So that's why I wanted to talk about vario lag. If you open up when the vario is coming up, you are probably going to move too late. Now, this is a problem of timing. The faster the glider, or the smaller the thermal, the more it is a problem. The slower the vario, the more it is a problem. The faster the vario, the less it is a problem. If you're flying a paraglider, what you probably do is when you start to hear the vario going up, 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 you straighten up and you go straight, 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 and the vario goes, and then you turn and you'll be in the middle. If you're flying a JS3 full of water out of Benalla last year in the Worlds, then if you straighten up as the vario's coming up, you're through the core and out the other side and down the other side of the thermal, just like that, because you're flying at like 60 knots and the thermals are tiny and you just go straight across the core. So it's a movable feast, but at least you have to know the dynamic. You have to understand the dynamic of the problem, and then you've got some chance of dealing with it. So if you're not, if you think moving on the vario coming up is late, what about moving on vertical acceleration? Jen said, we move when we feel the gust, meaning surge. You move as the glider feels like it's going uphill.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yep.
John Williamson, he was a friend of mine, he used to teach at Benalla, old British national coach, used to say, flying on a thermal is like flying on a coolie's hat, a Chinaman's hat, back in the days when you could be politically incorrect. You know, as you go up and down up and around the thermal, you go up and down and up and down, and it feels like going up and down. I talk about Teletubby Hill. Did you get the Teletubbies in Australia? Okay, so remember the Teletubbies, Tinky Winky, Lala, Po, they all lived on that hill in that hill, and it's like driving a golf cart around that hill, or a ute up and down the hill. You go up, you go down, you go up. So when you're going up, you go up the hill. You straighten up and you go up the hill. Now I call that, it's a useful meme, useful for teaching students. Keep the bank on until you feel like you're going uphill again, and then push it up the hill. And by pushing it up the hill, if you visualize you're in the cockpit and you're turning fairly tight, you're going to push the glider. Let's say you're going to the right. Just visualize how you move the glider. You move the stick to the left and forwards to stop it pitching up, right? The stick comes out of the back right-hand corner of the cockpit, and it goes forwards towards the forward left-hand side of the cockpit. Not very far. So there's just a push with the stick to the forwards and outside, and that is up the hill of the thermal. So if you say push it up the hill, especially if you're talking to a student, you'll do two things. One, you'll get him to feel where the hill is, or you'll do it yourself. Two, as you roll out of the thermal, you have to move the stick forwards. You can't do this up the thermal. You've got to do that to push it on. Otherwise, speed goes away and you can't turn. So push it up the hill is it's a good way of putting it. And then you turn again when you reach the top of the hill. Now, that is fine. That's a really good technique, but it is not reliable. And it is not reliable because the sense of acceleration is almost certainly the strongest sense of acceleration where you're not in the right place to push it up the hill. And this is, I'll show you what I mean. I've spent the last three springs at Narromine doing these one-on-one soaring courses, and I've been sitting in Australian thermals watching really carefully what people do wrong, trying to are not going to be successful. The dotted lines are where the thermal is, the turn is opened, all right? The one in the middle, the grey glider, the one that goes right across the core of the thermal, he's doing exactly as told. As he comes into the climb, here, come on, there. As he comes into the climb here, he feels it, and he pushes the glider up the hill. But look where he is. When he's opened the bank, he's pointing straight at the middle of the core. So he's not going to go around the core. By opening up to come out the contour lines, come across the contour lines, you will feel the strongest acceleration when the nose is pointing straight at the core, assuming the thermal is circular. If the thermal's circular, the point at which you feel the most acceleration going up the hill is when you're pointing at the core. That is too late. You need to be opening out the turn before that point. So let's, so the glider on the left is opening up the turn before that point. He's feeling the acceleration and he's lucky, he's sensitive and he's lucky, but the other guys either across the core or still outside the core and feeling pretty much the same acceleration. The most obvious cues are the ones that are going to take you straight towards the core. So that is a problem. In order to counter that, you can't really feel the acceleration and go, I'm not going that way, I'll go that way. You can't really do this. The glider's too clumsy to move across and then come back into the core like that. All you could do is to do it earlier. So not when you feel the acceleration as you run up the slope towards the core, but to move when you are coming out of the sink. And that is a bit counterintuitive, because what happens is we come around the thermal and we go up the slope and we go, oh yes, the core's this way, the core's this way, the core's this way, here it is. And yes, you've done exactly that. You've flown right towards the core, but you don't want to fly towards the core. You want to fly around the core. You want to fly around it. This is super important. I need a prop here. Think of an eclipse. Think of the moon going across to cover the sun. It has to do this. You're trying to move one circle to cover another circle. You are not trying to find the middle of the thermal. You are trying to fly a circle around the middle. You can't be in the middle of the thermal, not for more than a split second. So what you're trying to do is that. So you see where my thumb is there? I'm not trying to move the glider in that direction. You see my thumb going into the middle of the circle. I'm not trying to move my thumb in that direction. I'm trying to move my circle in that direction. And that, bit of an echo in here. Ooh, that is a completely different concept. That is actually a different concept. You're not looking to fly the glider into the core. You're looking to fly around the core. So what I have in my mind, there's the core of the thermal, and here's the glider flying around the core, and I'm just missing the core. I'm coming around and I'm just missing the core, and I'm coming around and I'm just missing the core. What I'm trying to do when I'm here is I'm thinking the core is here, and I'm trying to go around the core. I'm not trying to go through the core. I'm trying to go around it. So when I'm in the cockpit and I'm looking at the thermal and I'm thinking the core's there, I want to go around. So when you're opening up, you shouldn't be thinking, I'm going to the core, I'm going into the core. What you should be doing is opening up and thinking, I need the core over there slightly, over this direction when I open up, because I'm going to travel and the core's going to come around beside me, and I'm going to go into the side of the core, not straight into the core. I don't want to go around it. You need to get your head around this. It's a different way of thinking. And most people, when they're centering the thermal, will drive the glider into the core and not around it. So just stopping there for a moment, how does that sound? Does that make sense to you guys? Or does it sound like I'm talking about my arse?
Well, we can see what we're trying to do, but the question is then, how do you do it?
Okay, so how do you do it? Two ways. One is orientation and history. Orientation and the history and orientation are the same thing. This glider has been going around in the core, in and out of the core. I think you've got the diagram, yeah? The glider's been going around and going through the core and then going into the sink. We know where the core is. I've just moved over to put the glider in the core, and a lot of you will be able to just do that. You'll go, oh, the core's over there. I'll roll out and go into the core. But if you think about when this glider is rolling out, the Vario is nowhere near the top of its range. If you've got 6 knots in the middle, the Vario is saying 1 or 2 knots there. And furthermore, it is probably only coming up from 0 to 1 or 2 knots at this stage. It's just started to come up a bit. It's nowhere near the best. It's only just started to move away from the worst readings. If that, the acceleration may well be very weak, because you're kind of away from the strongest contour lines of acceleration. Strongest contour lines would probably be if you were about here, not if you're here. So this one is done on history. We know the core's over there. You can see where you have to open now in order to be in the right place. But what are the clues if you're not going on history? All I can say is this. fly away from the sink. If you fly away from the sink, if as you leave the sink, you go, I don't want to be there again, and you straighten up and you fly with the wings less bank for a little bit, so you don't go back to that sink. That is actually a very powerful way of centering the thermal. It gives you a move which is early enough that you're more likely to go around the core than go straight across the core and down the other side. Now, I've got something to say about this flying away from sink. This is essentially the worst heading method. You're in the heavy sink, you're in the worst part of the thermal. Let's say you're right turn again. When you're in the worst part of the thermal on the variometer, you're looking down the wing towards the right, to the inside wingtip, and the core should be slightly in front of your wing. You think about the positioning. It's not at 90 degrees, because at 90 degrees, it would be at 90 degrees if the vario was instant, but the vario isn't instant. The vario is 30 seconds behind. So at this point, let's come back again. At this point here, where I've written sink, that's the worst sink. But on the vario, it's very slightly further around the turn, maybe there, 30 degrees further on, 20 degrees further on. If you visualize having the glider at that point, the core of the thermal is in front of the right wingtip. It's at the 2 o'clock position, not the 3 o'clock position. So you look there, and as you point in that direction, you open the turnout and you go that way a bit. So it's the worst heading method, really, the worst heading method, but minus about 30 degrees, because you're a little bit further around. Now that works pretty well if you're doing the fly away from sink thing. And as an aside, I gave this briefing, or something very much like it, to 5 current world champions and a whole bunch of about half a dozen of the South African team. I was doing the coaching at the Swallow Challenge thing, and we were just talking about techniques. So, you know, what do? You've got to, giving briefings to 5 world champions was fairly hard. Michael Summer, Sebastian Cower, Victor Stychek, Karol Stychek, a whole bunch of them. So no pressure there. And at the end of it, I said, okay, guys, you're all better than I am at this. What do you think about the briefing? And everybody said, yeah, that all makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. It's a good way to teach it, except for Sebastian Cower. And he said, gee, you have to talk about moving away from sink. You have to talk about moving away from sink, because that's what he does. And he is arguably the best competition pilot ever. And he does this move away from sink thing as a real strong clue. So I'll leave that with you. We needed to talk about entering thermals, and we needed to talk about looking out. Shall we talk about looking out next? David, is I'm not sharing, am I? No. David, is that I know we're running on a bit. David, is that reasonable? You've gone dark.
Yeah, yes, please. Yeah, the sun's setting here.
Okay, so let's talk about joining thermals. It's been my experience that Australians and Kiwis have a different approach and a different ability to look out. Generally, Americans from the Midwest are pretty bad as well. You guys are not great at it. The Europeans are also not great at it, but we are more comfortable flying in clouds and clouds of aircraft, because that's what we do. I don't think we're necessarily any better at dodging them. We're just more comfortable with the problem. So I'm not going to talk about scanning and the fact that the glider that's stationary in your, oh, Peter's holding up a bag there. What are you looking at, Peter? I'm not going to talk about the visual acuity of the eye, the scanning problem. I think you probably know about that basic stuff. The glider that's going to hit you, stay stationary, stay stationary, stay stationary, stay stationary, stay stationary. Whoa! Suddenly it's right there. That's a problem. You have to scan proactively. When you're running with gliders, they will disappear even when you know that where they are. A glider has a visual signature. If it's coming straight towards you, you're going straight away. The visual signature is tiny, 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 tiny. It's really small. So it's very hard to see. If you look at a glider on Aerotow, quite a lot of the time, the glider will be invisible and you can see the tow plane. You know, if it's at the limits of visibility, you'll be able to see the tow plane before you can see the glider. So you have to keep track of where the glider is. You have to proactively monitor where those other people are and keep track of them. I do a lot of team flying, and you can lose your teammate as easy as pie. You're looking and you're looking and you're looking and you know exactly where he is and you still can't see him. So if you didn't know he was there, you still wouldn't be able to, you absolutely wouldn't be able to pick him up. So that's the first thing. I use the FLAM all the time. I have the FLAM radar screen up a lot of the time, and I keep track of gliders using the FLAM to make sure I know where they still are. That's not the same as replacing the lookout, it's supplanting the lookout. So if there's a glider behind you, and you know he's there, and you've picked him up on the FLAM, and you know John is 100 yards behind you, and you know who John is, and you know what he's going to do. He's going to follow you to the next thermal. You know he's going to still be there. And every so often you look at the FLAM and go, yeah, John's there. Look at the FLAM, yeah, John's there. Look at the FLAM, yeah, John's there. So when you start to maneuver, you've got a fair idea that John is still behind you. You've got to do that if you're flying in company. If you're not using FLAM radar, it's really useful. And the best, most malleable one I've discovered so far is to use the FLAM radar on the UDI. I think the LX does a good FLAM radar. The ClearNav does a good FLAM radar. It's worth having. You can't move the glider around enough to clear the traffic behind you. When you're going to turn, it's not the glider here that you're going to hit. It's the glider who's following behind you. So that glider is there. He's not there. He's not there. He's there. So if you look back and you can see the tip of the tailplane here behind you, if you look back that far, you've got a chance of seeing the glider that you're going to hit when you turn. If you don't look out that far, you've got no chance. If you wallow off cross sideways, not looking out, yeah, you could wander into the glider next to you. But that's not the one you're going to hit when you go wham in the thermal. Because we team fly like this, and we'll turn towards each other. And it's not a problem because you can see them and you go boom, boom, and it's not a problem. It's absolutely no problem at all. You can see the glider, but I wouldn't follow somebody here. I just wouldn't be here. I'd follow somebody here, not here, because if they pull up, you can't see them. But I'd follow somebody in line astern, even reasonably close. But I wouldn't follow somebody slightly above, a couple of 100 yards behind, because you've only got to look away. And you look forward and this glider's done this in front of you. It's a really dangerous place to be. So don't follow in that position and use the FLAM radar. When you join the thermal, you will see gliders in the thermal and you'll aim to miss them, obviously. You wander in and you try to miss them. Don't fly to the middle of the thermal. Fly to a turn which is concentric with the other glider. So when the glider's turning, where's my Spitfire? You're looking at a glider turning in a thermal. When you've got that picture of the glider, when he's there, as opposed to when he's there, you look at that part of the sky, it's here. You look at that part of the sky or that part of the ground and you fly to that point. You fly to where you saw his tail pointing at you. That is to join concentric with his circle. Beginners will fly to the middle of the thermal. You might fly to the middle of the thermal. When you're joining above or underneath, especially when you're joining underneath. It is very hard to position yourself concentric with the circle. It is easy to go inside and be in the core and then off to one side. We were talking about this with centering. It's also easy when you join underneath another glider. It's hard to join absolutely underneath. You have to look like that to join in the right place. So join concentric, that's important. Work your way in. That is civilized and obvious, and it's not a thing that people tend to have problems with. It's only being aggressive, diving straight into the core, being aggressive. Some people are a bit aggressive, and all I can say is don't do that. Work your way in. It's not hard to do. The real problem is the other gliders joining. There's two. The other gliders joining, so you need to look at people coming from different directions. It's not just the glider you've seen in the thermal. Other people might be doing what you're doing, and they might not be coming from the same place. If it's a start zone, if it's local to the club, people could be coming from anywhere. So you have to look out. You have to look for them. And when you're sitting in the glider, lying back in a nice comfortable seat, here am I sitting in the glider, lying back in a nice comfortable seat, flying the glider, and the instrument panel is up here. And I'm just, especially if you're flying the Antar, Dave, the instrument panel's up here. It's like, most gliders, you've got a reasonable view over the nose, but it is over the nose. There is a lot of nose in the way. You're joining a thermal. Where is the glider that you're going to hit? You're half a kilometer out. Where's the glider that you're likely to hit? Okay, if you're pulling up hard, fine. But if you're just waffling in at 60, 70 knots and you're not pulling up, and the gliders are climbing really fast, you could quite easily hit the glider that's under the nose. So as you come into the thermal, there's only one way to look for the gliders under the nose, and that's to just do this a little bit. And look, you can't look over the nose. I suppose you could do that. You could just do that. If I'm flying an airplane in a gliding environment, a busy environment, and I'm flying an airplane, I'll go just to look over the front. And, you know, in a high wing tow plane, you go look under the wing before you turn. You know, if you're flying a Super Cub in a gliding environment, you're going to turn right, or you're in the circuit, you're going to turn right, you'll go. It's quite common to get the piece of airplane out of the way so you can see and then turn. Experienced tow pilot flying a Super Cub, you'll see them doing that all the time. You look where you're going to go. In the sailplane, running into the thermal is one of the only times that this is a problem. You should move the nose out of the way and look underneath the nose. The other time it's a problem is in the circuit. If you join the circuit, if you fly down the downwind leg with the brakes open, you're really dangerous to the people in the circuit already. You should never do that. When you join the airfield from high up, you could either do an overhead join and a dead side descent like an aeroplane, or you can go out to one side and spiral down, cranked well over so you can see underneath. But what you never do is join the circuit 700 or 800 feet too high and then let down on the downwind leg. That is really, really dangerous. Do not do it. So that's joining the thermal. You have to look underneath and you have to look for other traffic. Maintaining your station in a thermal. Yeah, well, I've got the scars to prove that that's not as easy, because the guy that took me out was maintaining station behind me, behind me, behind me. And then he went, boom. So imagine you're in his glider. I was in his 2 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock high, over the top. And he looks down and he looks at the ASI and he goes, oh, I'm a little bit fast. And he pulls up and I was here. You can try this experiment. Peripheral vision's really interesting. You have a wide screen format. If you take your fingertips back and keep your fingertips moving and take them back, I lose sight of my fingertips just about there. And that's almost 90 degrees. That's almost 180-degree field of view. But if I put my fingertip here and I start to move it, and I can't see 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 it, and I can see it now. So if I do that again from here, I can't see it, I can't see it, I can't see it, I can see it now. And that is, it's a big angle forwards from my forehead. Because of course your eyes are set under the brows and you can't see up. So you might catch sight of another aircraft on your wingtip, but you're not going to catch sight of the aircraft here. You're not going to see him. You're not going to see him unless you do that. The guy that hit me from underneath did not see me even when he had hit me. There was just a bang and his glider sort of fell out of the air. He was all right. He didn't see me. Didn't see the glider he hit. And he was very slightly behind me. He was far enough behind me that his wing went through the back of my fuselage. So I was ahead of him and he still didn't see me. He was like this, looking at the instruments, and my glider was right above him. You know, imagine, there you are, 1 foot underneath the DG-100 and you still don't see it. That's how the eye works. You don't see stuff that's in front of you above. It has to be a long way in front. So you have to look up. This is the point. You have to look up. And if you look at the reverse of that, oh, fantastic. Coffee. The reverse of that is you have to look down because the guy underneath is not going to look up and see you above him. So you have to look down to make sure the guy underneath doesn't fly into you. So do not fly immediately underneath other people. That is stupid. Expect that you will not see anything above you unless you look. Keep looking proactively. The scan is not just around, you have to look up. When you're turning, it's kind of easy to look down because, you know, you lean the, most of us, you know, we're human beings, we're descended from things that lived in trees. We're quite aware of the vertical. If you lean the glider over, it is impossible not to go, whoa, there's 6,000 feet of empty space there. You know, you're just aware of it. You can't not be aware of it. It's like having a brown snake in the corner of the living room. You would be aware of it all the time. Might be a pet brown, but you'd be aware of it. If you had a snake in the room, you'd know exactly where it is all the time. When you're in the glider, you roll the thing over and boom, there's 6,000 feet of empty air. You're aware of that. You look down at it. One of people's problems with flying is they look down there. So look down in the thermal quite a lot. Look down the wing, see the glider there, it's easy. It's more difficult to look up at the glider that's above you. It tends to be something that's forgotten. Maintaining station, don't point your nose at the other airplane. Point the nose outside the other airplane, not at the other airplane. If you point your nose at the other airplane, you will be flying a tighter turn and you will catch up with him and eventually you'll run up his arse. So don't point at the other glider. It's not the way to do it. If you're going to turn inside, if you're going to turn inside another glider, you get right up his arse and then you rack on a lot of bank, and at that moment, once you've done that, it is impossible for him to hit you. At that point, if you do it from right behind him, you know, fairly close behind him, and you go, whomp, he can't hit you. He can't turn into you, which is just as well, because once you're committed, you cannot see the other aircraft. If you're going to turn inside somebody, you need to really take it with a great deal of caution. If there's any other gliders in the thermal, you can really screw them up. Because if you try to turn inside somebody and they're further round the turn, if the glider's here and you're here and now you turn inside, you can get this thing going on. If you're like 40 degrees around the turn from behind him and you turn hard, he can turn hard and he can hit you. He can only not hit you if you turn from pretty much immediately behind him. Then he can't hit you. So if you're going to turn inside another glider that's well ahead of you and around the turn, no, you never, ever, ever do that, because you'll put yourself in a closing position. The only circumstance where you can turn inside is if you've ended up right behind the guy. And yeah, it will happen. You will do it, but you need to be really cautious about deciding not to do it unless you're in the right place to start. Here's the thing. Matt Gage suggested this to me, and I thought it was a good suggestion. And we were looking at, let's start again. On the London Underground, there are really, really long escalators and there are lots of people. So what's fastest? Is it to walk up the escalator trying to get past all the other people, or is it to just stand on the escalator and not walk up it? You walk on and you wait. And the answer is you get more traffic through if you have a disciplined system where you just get onto the escalator and you stand there. You have less traffic through if people walk up the side of the escalator. And the reason you have less traffic is it makes a mess. It makes chaos at the beginning and the end, and people are bumbling, and you end up with less traffic flow on the escalator than if it's coordinated, two people side by side, step, step, step. When you're going up a thermal, it's a perfectly reasonable argument to suggest that a crowded gaggle goes up a thermal better if everybody flies in formation and nobody mucks around. Nobody tries to carve through. As soon as you start carving through, people have to move. When people move, they move out of the core. People are dodging, and then there's a glider circling and it's not in the core, so you can't be in the core, and the whole thing slows down and is a mess. The best way to climb in a gaggle is to climb cooperatively, not to try and push past the other gliders. Yes, you might have a situation where you've got a beginner in front of you flying an old glider and they're completely in the way, and the only thing to do is to climb past them, and at some stage you'll turn inside them and climb away. It's pretty rare. It's a pretty rare situation. If you're flying competitively, you do not want to reach the top of the thermal first. If you join a gaggle, you don't want to be the first person out of it. You want to be following the other gliders, not leading the other gliders. That's a disaster if you're gaggle flying. That's a whole nother subject, right? There's a whole nother subject. But if you're a competitive pilot, climbing to the top of the gaggle and leaving on track first is of no advantage. There's no point in leaving the gaggle first. That they'll run you down. If you find a climb, they'll run you down. If you don't find the climb, they'll go another place and get a climb and you'll be behind them again. It's a waste of time. So nobody wants to be the first to leave the gaggle. So why would you, what's the problem? You just park and you wander up quietly. Leaving the thermal. Generally, the way to leave a thermal is about 30 degrees before, we're going that way, right? Where's my airplane? We're going to leave towards the screen. About 30 degrees before you leave, you let the stick come back. Sorry, you let the stick come forwards. You take off the pull and you bring the G down to 1G. And at 1G in a 45-degree turn, the nose will slide down. You're not pushing, you're not going below 1G. You're holding 1G, the nose goes down. At the same time, you roll out and you're gone. You don't do this. You don't roll level and then push. You don't push out of the turn. You just relax the pull and it goes away. And you know, if you're turning at 45 degrees of bank and you relax the pull, you'll leave the thermal doing 70, 75, 80. You've got the nose in the right attitude to gently accelerate. If there's a glider underneath you, you'll fly down on top of him when you do that. So before you turn, you have to look down the inside of the turn. But sorry, before you straighten, you have to look down the inside of the turn. You have to look down. You can see better, you can see the glider here. I haven't got my other airplane. I've got two airplanes here. Okay, so now we've got two airplanes. I can see the airplane underneath me by looking down the inside of the cockpit. I can't see the airplane underneath me no matter how hard I look outside the turn, because my view underneath is blocked by the cockpit. My view underneath is good if I look down the inside of the turn. So training, they say, when you straighten up, look outside the turn before you straighten up. And you should do that because if there's an aircraft here and you roll out, you'll have him. So you look outside the turn to see the airplane here, maybe even slightly back a little bit. I call it looking under your armpit. You look underneath the wing there to see if there's a glider outside you, but you will not see the glider underneath. You've got to look down the inside. So about 180 degrees before I leave the thermal, I look down underneath the glider, try and look right underneath. And then I look outside the turn, and then the target's coming around in front of me, and I relax the pull and I let the glider run. You could say, well, don't let the nose go down as you leave, then you won't fly into another glider. But the trouble is, once you've left level, you can't see underneath to accelerate. You can't see underneath you when you're level. You have to do that or that to look underneath. So it's actually better to look underneath and leave in a shallow dive into a piece of airspace that you've cleared rather than leave level. And that is leaving thermals. I think that's probably all I need to talk about, Dave.
I think we are done, G, as advertised. Thank you. But while you consume a couple of mouthfuls, any questions before we let G go and have his bacon and eggs? And we have Roger here to give us our cheese and biscuits.
It may have been asked before, but when can we expect to see Soaring Engine 3?
Oh, okay. I've just finished proofing it and I'm waiting for the forwards, and it's going to press in about 10 days.
Good to hear. Thank you.
So you'll get it. Where are you now? You'll get it. It'll take a while to get it to Swift. You're probably talking about 5 or 6 weeks from now, something like that. But it's coming. These diagrams are from Soaring Engine 3. Ralph asked a question on the chat. In glider reviews, it says, keep reading, glider climbs well or poorly. What does that mean? Just reasonable circle tightness at reasonable LD, or what else? Ralph, it's not... just about all gliders have very similar performance. All the modern gliders have very similar performance. The sink rate and airspeed are governed by the wing loading. So if you have a high wing loading glider, like, let's say you're a big chap, I don't know. Let's say you're a big chap and you're flying an LS7 without winglets, it's already a heavy wing loading. So when you're circling, you'll be flying quite a fast turn and you'll have quite a high descent rate. So the raw numbers could be worse than, say, somebody in a K8 with a very low flying speed and a low descent rate. So it depends on the flying speed and the descent rate, but generally most gliders are in similar ballpark. The problem with climbing well, climbing badly is more of the feel of the glider. Some gliders, when you fly into lift, you can really feel it. as the angle of attack changes, the coefficient of lift changes, and the glider responds, and it goes up well as it flies into the surge, and it's a good feel. Some gliders are dead. The top of the coefficient of lift curve is flat, which means that you're flying tight, you're flying a high coefficient of lift anyway. Increase the angle of attack, and the coefficient of lift doesn't change very much, and the glider doesn't really accelerate upwards very much, which means you can't feel it. The 24, 27, and 29 are like that, whereas the discus and the discus and the duodiscus and the ventuses aren't like that. You feel the air better. The discus 2 is a bit, you don't really feel the air very well with that either. So it can be subtle. Wing loading speed to fly is one thing, controlling the sink rate, but the other thing is the shape of the coefficient of lift curve. And some gliders are generally, here's the thing, if it's got tips like a Schemps glider, it will climb pretty well, generally. If it's got tips like a DG 100, 200, 300, 400, or if it's got tips like the ASW 24 or the LS4, in other words, either swept forwards trailing edge or symmetrically tapered wingtips, it won't climb as well. And that's because the sweep at the tips controls the flow at the tips, and the flow at the tips controls how much tipped vortex you get. So a swept forward wing generates a more tipped vortex than a swept back wing in a glider. So the answer is there's a lot of subtleties, but generally, like most things, you need to fly the airplane. You need to learn to fly the airplane. You can learn to climb an LS7 as well as anybody in anything, more or less. So yeah, that's your answer. More questions?
Yeah, I've got one, G. Now, just a little thing I've picked up there, and you might be able to tell me if I've got the wrong impression or not, but you're talking about leaving the thermal, you're talking about letting it go, letting it run.
Yeah, let it run.
To me, implies that you're relaxing the pull. So the impression that gives me is that when you enter that thermal, you're not necessarily bothering about changing the trim much. You might accept a bit of pull as you are climbing.
Okay. So this is what I do. I have the glider trimmed for about 30 degrees of bank.
Okay.
In other words, when you're centering, you have a choice. You can have it absolutely trimmed at 45 degrees of bank, then roll out. You have to push a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can be pulling in the core, and then when you roll out, relax the pull. In other words, you have it trimmed for the bank angle. A lot of gliders are awkward to retrim. The DG 1000 is awkward to retrim. The duodiscus is awkward to retrim. The ASW 24 is awkward to retrim. The duodiscus has a very light stick force. The 24 has a heavy stick force. If I trim it for 45 degrees and roll out, I have to shove on the stick. It's actually uncomfortably heavy.
Ridiculous.
The DG 1000 is like that. The duodiscus is as light as, you just ease it. It doesn't really, the trim is not very effective at that speed. So it's a little difficult to say. I have the glider trimmed for the circle. Generally, people will have a little pulling force when they're in a tight turn. They'll have trimmed a lot of it out, but they'll end up with a little pull. I do trim for the circle, but it's kind of subtle. The Lebel was a lot easier than the 24. The 24 is just a bit clumsy in pitch in that way. I'd like the trimmer to be much, much lighter. I'd like the elevator force to be much, much lighter, but it isn't. Yeah, it is what you get.
Right, guys. I think we've got time for just one more question. Then we need to move on to convergence.
If nobody else has got one, the climbing cooperatively in a thermal, you've got others with you. You want to get the best out of this thermal. you find that, okay, and you're using the other gliders as your variometer. They're the best variometer you've got. You're watching them around the turn. So when you can see that they're in better lift than you are, then you're going to straighten up behind their tail. And if you're catching it, because I find this problem all the time, because I turn a tighter circle than other people in the K6. So when I want to widen out, you make sure you do that in lift and straighten up behind his tail, head to where he was in the lift. And that can lead to, well, it keeps your separation, it keeps them opposite you, and it keeps you in the best lift, hopefully, for a cooperative
Yes.
bit of lift.
Yeah. One thing I didn't say is you maintain station if the glider needs to be ahead of you or out to the side, and if the glider's coming around your tail, you turn tighter. If the glider's coming in front of your nose, you turn less tight. I forgot to mention that. What you say, Jen, is very true. If you're really flying competitively, if I'm not in a crowded thermal, if I'm in a thermal with 1 or 2 people in it, I will commit to rolling out a bit across the core and slowing the glider down a bit to suck it up and waiting for the other glider to go around the turn as I go across the core and suck it up and then tuck in again.
Yeah.
You can do that. You can do that because you know where the edges of lift and sink are, and you're not going to fly out of the thermal because you can see the other gliders. That does raise a problem with the guy behind you. If it's a crowded thermal, you can't really do it. It's a technique that I've used it to sneak past other competitors. If you just go across the core, going up, and tuck, and you get at a few feet each circle. It can be useful. It can be useful. I guess the thing about flying with other gliders is you don't need to look at your vario. But here's the thing. When you're flying with a gaggle, it's like you're driving a car down a twisty country road. You're driving a car down a twisty country lane. It's great fun. You can hammer around the corners, blah, blah, blah. Great fun. If you're in traffic, you're stuck. Can't do a thing. You're in traffic. You know, you got to live with it. If you're in a gaggle, you're in traffic. You can't do anything. You're in traffic. You are part of the traffic. The benefits of gaggle flying do not come when you're in the thermal. The benefits of gaggle flying are that on average, over a long period of time, you will do better. You will do better because you'll average out that moment at which you were going to get stuck. You won't get stuck because the gaggle found the thermal. So the gaggle flies at 80%, and you might be flying at 100% all the time until you get that one time in a flight that you get stuck, or even the one time in a competition, and suddenly you're flying at 30% and you're there for half an hour. And if that happens once in a competition, you're screwed. You know, at top level, you don't want it to happen. So everybody flies in their gaggles to fly at 80 to 90% all the time, even though it's kind of like just being on the motorway in traffic. You can't do anything. You're on cruise control. You know, you can't do anything. It's a funny way to fly, but that's what we do.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Matt. It's been great to hear you, and I really hope that we get to see you in the flesh at Narromine Cup Week this year.
Look, if it is practical for me to get to Australia, I will get to Australia. And if I can't come this year, I will come next year. You know, what can I say? It's driving me barking mad, but you know, our problems are small compared to many. So
Indeed. Okay.
Hope to see you. And well, thank you for having me. It's been really useful to me and been great fun. So
thank you, G.
And it's been nice to see a
Appreciate
few faces that I haven't seen for a while. So you look after